Dean Martin was known for making people smile. But one night, he stopped an entire show, not for fame, not for applause, but because one woman in the front row couldn't stop crying. What he did next changed everyone in that room forever. So let's start our story. The lights inside the packed theater glowed warm and golden, washing over rows of expectant faces that had come not just to hear music, but to feel something familiar, something comforting. This was the era when entertainment felt personal, when stars didn't just perform, they shared pieces of themselves, even if most people didn't realize it at the time. And standing at the center of that glowing stage was Dean Martin, relaxed, smiling, and seemingly untouched by the weight of the world. To the audience, he was the embodiment of ease, the man with the crooked grin, the smooth voice, and the reputation of someone who never let anything bother him. But that night, something happened that revealed a side of Dean Martin few ever truly saw. Dean Martin had built his entire public image on effortlessness. While other performers rehearsed obsessively, Dean appeared to float through his shows as if they were casual conversations, rather than meticulously planned productions. He leaned into the microphone, delivered his lines with a half-smile, and sang as though the music had simply decided to pass through him. Audiences loved him for that. They felt safe in his presence. They felt entertained without being overwhelmed. And most importantly, they felt seen, though they couldn't quite explain why. That night's performance began like countless others before it. The band struck the opening notes. The crowd erupted into applause, and Dean acknowledged them with a nod that said, "I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad to be here too." His voice filled the room, rich and warm, wrapping itself around every lyric as if it were telling a story meant for each individual listener. Couples leaned closer together. Some mouthed the words. Others simply closed their eyes and let the sound wash over them. From the stage, Dean could see everything. Performers like him learned early how to scan a crowd without looking like they were doing it. He could spot the excited fans, the nervous first-timers, the seasoned regulars who had seen him perform more times than they could count. He could read a room the way a sailor reads the sea. And somewhere in the front row, just beyond the glare of the footlights, something felt different. At first, it was subtle, a stillness where there should have been movement, a heaviness where there should have been smiles. Dean didn't stop singing. He didn't miss a note, but part of his attention drifted downward, toward a woman seated close enough that he could make out her expression when the lights hit just right. She wasn't clapping. She wasn't smiling. She was crying. Not the dramatic kind of crying people sometimes do when a song reminds them of a romance or a happy memory. This was quiet, controlled, the kind of crying someone does when they don't want to be seen, but can't hold it in anymore. Tears traced slow lines down her face as she stared toward the stage. Not at Dean, but through him, as if the music had opened a door she had tried very hard to keep shut. Most performers would have looked away, not out of cruelty, but out of training. You don't interrupt a show. You don't single out an audience member. You keep the rhythm. You keep the illusion intact. But Dean Martin had never been most performers. His voice softened almost imperceptibly, and the band, experienced enough to sense a shift, followed him without question. The song ended, not with its usual flourish, but with a gentle resolve that hung in the air longer than expected. The applause came, but it was uneven, confused, as if the audience sensed that something had changed, even if they didn't yet know what it was. Dean took a step forward, closer to the edge of the stage. The spotlight followed him, but his eyes were no longer focused on the crowd as a whole. They were fixed on that single woman in the front row. He rested one hand on the microphone stand, the other hanging loosely at his side. And for the first time that night, he didn't smile. "Hey," he said softly, his voice no longer performing but speaking. "You okay down there?" The theater went silent. People shifted in their seats. Some turned to look at the woman, suddenly aware that something deeply personal was unfolding in a public space. The band froze, instruments still in hand, waiting. Dean wasn't asking a rhetorical question. He wasn't delivering a scripted line. He was genuinely concerned. The woman looked up, startled, as if she hadn't realized she'd been seen. For a moment, it seemed like she might shake her head and wave him off, insisting she was fine. But something about Dean's tone, gentle, unhurried, sincere, made that impossible. Her shoulders trembled slightly, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to steady herself. Dean didn't rush her. He didn't crack a joke. He didn't try to lighten the moment with charm. He simply waited. Finally, she nodded, though it was clear she wasn't okay at all. "That song," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying beyond the first few rows. It reminded me of my husband." A murmur rippled through the audience. Not curiosity, but understanding. Everyone had lost someone. Everyone knew that feeling, the sudden ambush of memory. The way a melody could bring back a voice, a laugh, a life. Dean's expression changed then, not dramatically, but deeply. The smile never returned. He leaned closer, as if trying to close the distance between the stage and her pain. "I'm sorry," he said. Two simple words, spoken without polish, without performance. "Is he?" She nodded again, tears flowing freely now. "He passed last year. This was our song." The theater was completely still. Even the people in the back rows, who couldn't hear her words, felt the weight of the moment. This was no longer a show. This was real life breaking through the velvet curtain. Dean took a breath, slow and steady. Those who knew him well would later say that this was the moment they recognized something important, that beneath the relaxed persona and the carefully crafted image was a man who felt things intensely, even if he rarely showed it. "You know," Dean said after a pause, "I think music's funny that way. It doesn't ask permission before it brings someone back into the room." A few heads nodded. Someone wiped away a tear. Dean glanced back at the band, giving them a small signal to stand down. Then he turned his attention fully back to the woman. "Would it be all right," he asked gently, "if I sang something for him?" The woman covered her face, overwhelmed, and nodded. What happened next wasn't planned. It wasn't part of any rehearsal or contract. Dean Martin, one of the biggest stars in the world, made a decision in that moment that had nothing to do with applause or reputation. He stopped the show, not to command attention, but to give it. As the opening notes of the next song filled the theater, the mood shifted entirely. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a shared experience of memory, loss, and compassion. Dean's voice carried a new weight, every lyric shaped by intention. He sang not at the audience, but with them, as if they were all holding something fragile together. And as he sang, the woman in the front row cried openly, not from pain alone, but from the unexpected kindness of being acknowledged, of being seen in a room full of strangers. Few people that night realized they were witnessing something rare, not just a famous singer showing empathy, but a moment that revealed the true character of a man often misunderstood. Dean Martin was known for his charm, his humor, his apparent detachment from seriousness. But moments like this hinted at a deeper truth, one that would become even clearer as the story continued. Because this wasn't the first time Dean Martin had stopped a show for someone else, and it wouldn't be the last. And in the years that followed, stories like this would quietly circulate among musicians, crew members, and those lucky enough to be in the room when Dean chose humanity over performance. Stories that painted a very different picture of the man behind the microphone. In the next part of this story, we'll step away from the spotlight for a moment and look at the life, experiences that shaped Dean Martin into someone capable of such compassion. We'll explore the losses he carried, the pain he hid behind humor, and why moments like this one meant far more to him than applause ever could. Because to understand why Dean Martin stopped that show, you first have to understand the man who knew exactly what it felt like to be broken and still chose kindness. To understand why Dean Martin could sense pain in a darkened theater and feel compelled to stop an entire show for one stranger, you have to understand something most people never considered while watching him perform. Dean Martin was not detached from emotion. He was guarded by it. His humor, his relaxed posture, his effortless charm. These weren't signs of someone untouched by hardship. They were armor, carefully built over decades of loss, disappointment, and quiet heartbreak. Long before he became a symbol of smooth confidence, Dean Martin was Dino Paul Crocetti, the son of Italian immigrants who understood struggle before he ever understood fame. His early life was defined by hard work, insecurity, and the constant pressure to survive in a world that didn't offer second chances easily. He left school early. He took whatever jobs he could find. He boxed. He dealt cards. He sang wherever someone would listen. None of it came easily, and none of it came without cost. When success finally arrived, it came fast and loud. The partnership with Jerry Lewis launched him into stardom, but it also trapped him inside a public image that didn't always reflect who he really was. On stage, He was the calm half of a chaotic duo. Offstage, he was a man constantly trying to balance ambition with exhaustion. When the partnership ended, the public saw drama and ego. What they didn't see was how deeply the split affected him, how it reinforced his belief that attachment often led to pain. Then came the music career, the films, the Rat Pack years, an era immortalized as glamorous, carefree, and wild. But behind the laughter and late nights was a man who carried grief quietly. Dean Martin experienced personal losses that reshaped the way he viewed people, especially strangers. He learned, through pain, how easily joy could disappear, how quickly life could change in ways no one could control. Those who knew him well often said Dean listened more than he spoke. He watched. He noticed things others ignored. It wasn't unusual for him to remember names, faces, small details about people he met briefly. He understood something many performers didn't, that audiences weren't just there to be entertained. They came carrying their own stories, their own invisible burdens. That understanding is what made the moment in the theater so powerful. When Dean saw the woman crying, he didn't see a disruption. He saw himself. He recognized the quiet grief, the kind that doesn't scream for attention, but aches all the same. Music had done what it often does best. It had reached into a place she didn't expect and pulled something out she hadn't planned to share. As he sang for her husband that night, Dean wasn't simply offering comfort. He was honoring a shared human experience. The audience felt it too. People later recalled how the atmosphere in the room changed completely, how strangers seemed connected in a way that felt rare and fragile. Some held hands. Some cried silently. Others simply sat still, afraid to break the moment. When the song ended, the applause didn't come immediately. There was a pause, long, respectful, heavy with emotion. Then the clapping began, not loud or celebratory, but grateful. Dean nodded once, acknowledging it, but his focus remained on the woman in the front row. "Thank you for sharing him with us," he said quietly. Those words stayed with her long after the show ended. In later years, she would tell friends that she hadn't gone to the concert expecting healing. She had gone because she needed to feel close to something familiar. What she received instead was a reminder that grief didn't have to be hidden, that it could be met with kindness rather than discomfort. For Dean Martin, moments like this weren't about recognition. In fact, he rarely spoke about them publicly. Stories surfaced not through interviews or press releases, but through people who witnessed them, musicians, stagehands, audience members, who realized years later that they had seen something extraordinary without fully understanding it at the time. There were other nights, other shows, other interruptions, a grieving veteran, an elderly man removed by security, a woman overwhelmed by memory. Time and again, Dean chose compassion over performance. He would pause, redirect, sometimes even cancel a segment entirely if it meant preserving someone's dignity. This behavior confused some producers. Shows were scheduled tightly. Interruptions meant delays, adjustments, risk. But Dean was firm when it mattered. He believed that entertainment without humanity was empty. That belief didn't come from theory. It came from lived experience. One of the deepest wounds Dean carried was the loss of his son, Dino Jr. That tragedy didn't just break his heart, it reshaped his understanding of pain forever. Friends noticed the change. He became quieter, more introspective, less interested in excess, more attentive to moments that mattered. Grief had taught him something no success ever could, that everyone is fighting something unseen. Looking back, the night he stopped the show feels less like an exception and more like an inevitability. Of course, he noticed the woman crying. Of course, he stopped. Of course, he sang for someone who couldn't hear it anymore. That was who he was when the mask slipped. The audience that night didn't just witness a concert. They witnessed a moment of shared humanity, led by someone brave, enough to acknowledge pain in a world that often prefers distraction. And while many of them would remember the songs, the jokes, and the charm, a few would remember something far more important. The moment when a famous man chose to be simply human. As the show continued, Dean gently brought the room back to lighter ground. He cracked a small joke, not to erase what had happened, but to carry it forward without letting it overwhelm the evening. The audience followed him willingly. They trusted him. They knew he wouldn't trivialize what they had just experienced. But the impact lingered. People left the theater changed, even if they couldn't articulate why. Some called loved ones they hadn't spoken to in months. Some held on to memories with less bitterness and more gratitude. And one woman walked out feeling a little less alone than she had when she arrived. In the next and final part of this story, we'll explore what this moment came to represent in Dean Martin's legacy. We'll look at how quiet acts of compassion often define greatness more than fame ever can, and why stories like this continue to resonate decades later. Because the truth is, Dean Martin didn't stop the show that night to make history. He stopped it to honor a feeling. And sometimes, that's far more powerful. Long after the lights dimmed and the crowd slowly filed out into the night, the memory of that evening stayed alive, not in the headlines, not in newspaper reviews, but in the quiet places where moments like these truly live. The woman who sat in the front row would remember it not as the night she saw a famous singer, but as the night a stranger recognized her grief and treated it with dignity. And Dean Martin, though he would never publicly recount the moment, carried it with him as just another reminder of what truly mattered beneath the surface of fame. For decades, Dean Martin had been celebrated for making everything look easy. He was the man who seemed immune to stress, immune to seriousness, immune to the emotional weight that pressed down on so many others. But those closest to him knew the truth. Ease was not the absence of pain. It was the result of learning how to live with it. Dean had learned early that the world rarely slows down for grief. And so he taught himself how to move through it quietly, gently, without asking for attention. That understanding shaped the way he treated people, especially those who weren't asking to be noticed. He never believed that the stage separated him from the audience. In his mind, it connected them. Music was not a performance delivered from above, it was a bridge. And when someone stood trembling on that bridge, overwhelmed by memory or loss, Dean felt it was his responsibility to meet them there. As time passed, stories like the one from that night began to surface more frequently. Musicians who toured with him spoke of moments when he insisted on stopping rehearsals because someone on the crew was struggling. Venue staff recalled him quietly arranging transportation for elderly fans who couldn't stand in long lines. None of these acts were announced. None were recorded. They were done instinctively, without ceremony. In an industry built on illusion, Dean Martin's quiet compassion was real. The public, however, continued to see the surface image, the martini glass, the relaxed grin, the playful indifference. It was easier that way. Legends are simpler when they're one-dimensional. But those who looked closer saw a man who had been shaped by loss and softened by it rather than hardened. He understood something essential. That pain doesn't make people weak. And acknowledging it doesn't make moments smaller. It makes them meaningful. The woman in the front row would later describe the experience as something that changed how she viewed grief itself. She hadn't expected healing from a concert. She hadn't planned to cry in public. Yet when it happened, she wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't rushed. She wasn't ignored. Instead, she was met with patience and respect. Dean didn't try to fix her pain. He didn't minimize it. He simply gave it space to exist. That distinction mattered. In a world that often tells people to be strong or move on, Dean Martin did something radical. He paused. He let silence speak. He allowed music to serve its oldest purpose, connection. That pause, more than any note he sang that night, became the most powerful part of the performance. As the years went on, Dean performed less frequently. His health declined. The losses accumulated. Yet those who saw him in his later years often remarked that he seemed more present, more attentive, even as his voice softened and his movements slowed. Fame had given him many things, but it was empathy that defined his final chapters. When Dean Martin passed away, tributes poured in from around the world. Fellow performers spoke of his influence. Fans recalled songs that had soundtracked their lives. But scattered among those tributes were quieter stories of kindness shown in moments when cameras weren't rolling. Stories like the night he stopped a show because someone in the audience was hurting. Those stories endure because they remind us of something essential. Talent impresses. Success dazzles. But compassion stays. The truth is, Dean Martin could have kept singing that night. No one would have blamed him. The audience came for entertainment, and he was delivering it flawlessly. But he understood that the greatest moments aren't always the ones people come for. Sometimes they're the ones that happen when expectations are set aside. By stopping the show, Dean didn't disrupt the performance. He elevated it. He turned a concert into a shared human experience. He reminded everyone in that room that even in spaces designed for distraction, it's okay to feel deeply. That grief doesn't make someone weak. That being seen, even briefly, can ease a burden more than words ever could. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Dean Martin, not just the songs, the films, or the fame, but the moments when he chose empathy over applause. Moments that didn't make headlines, but made lives a little lighter. In the end, the woman walked away carrying her husband's memory with less weight and more warmth. The audience left knowing they had witnessed something rare. And Dean Martin walked off the stage the same way he always did, quietly, without fanfare, having once again proven that greatness isn't measured by how brightly you shine, but by how gently you treat those who are hurting. That night, Dean Martin didn't just stop a show. He listened. And sometimes, that's the most powerful performance of all.